This week we're starting Globalization. We tiptoed into it just a bit last week whenever we were talking about immigration and globalization of labor, or the lack thereof. But this week, we're going to start by focusing mostly on pure trade. And then the next class is going to delve a lot more into kind of the history, the political structure, and the political economy of globalization. So for this class, we're going to start by outlining a bit of theory about international trade. We're going to look at the implications for trade for both distribution within a country and economic development, along with highlighting some recent trends that have in contemporary trade. Then we're going to address the issue of balance of payments, which is one way that economists kind of track how a country is doing in terms of its international trade. It's a very important concept that we're going to talk about. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about contemporary trade agreements and what kind of goes on behind the scenes, and why contemporary trade agreements might be quite different than the trade agreements of old. So, diving right into theories of trade, the oldest theory that comes to us from very early political economists is the idea of absolute advantage. And this is the idea that nations should produce that which they are more efficient at producing than all other nations. An absolute advantage doesn't really imply a comparative advantage, which is the more kind of modern theory. This comes to us from Ricardo back in the 1800s, but we still fundamentally think as economists in this way today, that nations should produce that which they can produce at the lowest cost, including opportunity costs. So even if Portugal could produce wool at a lower cost than England, their comparative advantage in, say, producing wine means that they would be giving up a lot of welfare in terms of wine if they chose to only produce wool instead. And so the natural consequence of this comparative advantage argument is that countries are made better off by trade, even if they have absolute advantage in producing nothing. Here's a simplified example that kind of comes to us from Ricardo. These two lines that you see are production possibility frontiers. We're assuming that they're linear in this case to kind of simplify the example. And so the blue line here represents all bundles of cloth and wine that England could produce self-sufficiently. And the red line is the same production possibility frontier for Portugal if they don't trade. So we can see that if England dumps its entire productive capacity into cloth, it can produce 36 units, and if it dumps it entirely into wine, 30 units. And for Portugal, it's 40 units of cloth and 45 units of wine. And so in this model, Portugal has absolute advantage in producing both cloth and wine. So here in the first point, we see this green dot and orange dot added together. And we can see that total welfare in aggregate, if everybody produces self-sufficiently, is 34 units of cloth and 42 units of wine. Then if we instead say, well, what if England 100% specializes in cloth and Portugal 100% specializes in wine, both of which are commodities that they have comparative advantage in producing, we see that total welfare increases. We get 2 more units of cloth and we get 3 more units of wine. And so this is kind of Ricardo's comparative advantage model from the 1800s, but economists still fundamentally think this way. The modern equivalent model is Heckscher-Ohlin, which extends Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage to multiple nations. So instead of having 2 nations that are trading, you instead have an arbitrary number of nations, an arbitrary number of commodities. And so it's a more flexible model in that way. It typically assumes uniform technology across nations, which is different with Ricardo, because technology essentially defines this production possibility frontier. Ricardo just due to the math of his model, has to assume that they have different technologies. Heckscher-Ohlin can assume uniform technologies as a simplifying assumption. Arbitrary number of inputs, commodities, and countries. If you really crank through this model, its implications are that nations specialize in producing the commodities that use their abundant inputs and import commodities that use their scarce inputs. And then if you kind of cross this with welfare economics, the implication is that trade liberalization, so lowering barriers to trade, increases total output for all nations involved. And so, in essence, it's a really complicated and roundabout way to get to the same conclusion that Ricardo hit upon in the 1800s with Nerian equation. So, if all of economic theory says that trade makes us better off, what's this big argument about? Why are some people resistant to trade? Well, there are distributional consequences to trade liberalization. This is a highly simplified model, but the idea here is imagine that these are just aggregate supply and demand equations for imports. So on the left side there, you have the high tariff graph. And so the supply and demand curve are still in the same place, but we model a high tariff as a tax on the good. So that raises the price of the good above its equilibrium level. In that case, that's P sub B. And so because of that, we've got this large purple deadweight loss, and that represents a loss to both producer and consumer welfare. If we lower the tariff, as in the right-hand side graph, we see that the deadweight loss shrinks, so there's a less of a loss to total welfare. But what is also happening in this case is a massive redistribution. So in the first instance, there's a very small triangle at the top in the high tariff graph that represents consumer welfare. And everything in that rectangle below and the tiny red triangle at the very bottom is producer welfare. And in the low tariff scenario, we see that our consumer surplus has grown and our producer surplus has shrunk relative to each other. In absolute terms, they're both larger. So essentially, as tariffs become lower and lower and lower, it requires a greater amount of redistribution to shrink that deadweight loss triangle. And so this was actually empirically calculated for the case of the United States, I think around 2015, 2016. And with trade law as it was at that time, it was estimated that to get $1 in gains of trade from lowering tariffs or what have you, that would imply a $50 redistribution within the American economy. So this generates a policy implication where if barriers to trade are already quite high, it might make sense to liberalize trade. But if barriers to trade are already quite low, the gains relative to the redistribution are quite small. So now, if these redistributive effects were equally shared, if the gains of trade and these redistributive effects were, say, randomly distributed across the population, this wouldn't be a big deal. Everybody would share the gains and losses evenly. But we find that the same groups that benefit tend to benefit over and over again from liberalization of trade, and the groups that get hurt tend to get hurt over and over again. And so the groups that get hurt are low and low middle class workers who, for instance, used to work in manufacturing, and those jobs are now moved elsewhere. And so they've kind of dropped down the job ladder into the service industry. And the people that benefit from gains of trade are typically going to be wealthy owners of capital. So the problem is these redistributive effects are continually redistributing income upward, and the gains of trade are also typically more dense for wealthy people. So the typical concept of efficiency in economics is Pareto efficiency, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The idea that something is a Pareto improvement if the change in policy makes no one worse off while making others better off. But that's not what we have here. Trade liberalization is not a Pareto improving situation. It is efficient in a different schema called Kaldor-Hicks. And Kaldor-Hicks's efficiency says something is efficient if the benefits to the winners are large enough that the losers could be compensated for their loss. So this generates the further policy implication, well, why don't we just tax the winners of globalization and redistribute that to the losers of globalization, and we're all made better off? And so while supported by this kind of like alternative but widely accepted definition of efficiency, Kaldor-Hicks, these sorts of policies rarely come to be in practice. So we basically never implement some sort of compensation to liberalization of trade. It frankly just does not happen and should maybe be considered. So moving on from kind of a domestic context, let's think about the implications globally. And the essential fact is that trade has been a massive positive force for development for many countries. For instance, think about kind of the Asian miracle economies like Japan and South Korea, right? They managed to develop quite successfully in the post-war era by kind of mimicking many of the policies that the West had used. Now, the consensus around what a good development strategy was began to evolve around the 1980s. I believe I spoke about this briefly already, but the way that many of the Western economic powers managed to develop was by placing heavy restrictions on trade until they had already developed. And that's the similar strategy to what Japan and South Korea did. But in the 1980s, something called the Washington Consensus became kind of the dogma of development, and that essentially said you have to fully liberalize capital, commodity, and labor markets. Essentially implement neoliberalism in developing countries. You must privatize public entities, and so on. And this full-blown trade liberalization appears in practice to be far less successful than the limited trade liberalization where you still protect your home markets and allow infant industries to develop. This kind of limited trade openness seems to be a better development strategy. But in either case, trade is essential for development because exports give you cash as a nation, right? And you can use that cash to buy goods, inputs, capital, and other technology from other nations that you could maybe not produce yourself. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, many developing economies grow at a faster rate than already developed economies because they're able to kind of buy technology that's already developed without having to start from scratch themselves. So just to give you an idea of kind of the more recent changes in how international trade is carried out, let's talk about the scale of trade. So in the 60s, the average of imports and exports, so just total imports and total exports globally, which in theory should be equal, but we average them to kind of get a rough measure of the scale of global trade. In 1960s, the average of imports and exports was 12% of global GDP, and by 2011, it was almost 30%. Larger economies notice I say larger, not more, less developed, but larger economies tend to be less dependent on trade. By and large, most trade is still done in commodities. Trade and services makes up about 20% of global trade today, but still the vast majority of trade is commodity trade or other consumer goods. And developing nations have managed to increase their share in global trade from 10% in the 80s to 30% more recently. So everybody's trading more, but especially developing countries are trading more. The large economies trade a bit less, and so that's kind of gives you a picture of who's trading and how much. So all this being said, how do we take measurements of this? Well, we use this concept called the balance of payments. And the balance of payments is split into two parts, the current account and the capital and financial account. You can think about the current account as the net flow of incomes in and out of a country during, say, a year. The capital and financial account deal more with assets than flows, right? Stocks instead of flows. And so it's the change in liabilities and assets of a nation over a year. Balance of payments is only concerned with transactions that involve some outside foreign actor, be it as somebody selling you something or buying something from you, and purely domestic transactions don't factor into it. So, the current account, it's pretty straightforward. It's got trade, which is just the net trade in goods and services. I think that's a fairly easy concept to wrap your head around. Income includes the net movement of compensation to employees in and out of the country. So, for instance, if an American firm was paying wages to a subsidiary in a different nation with citizens of that nation working in it, that payment to those employees would count negatively towards our balance of payments. And also investment income. So, for instance, if an American owns a investment in, say, Germany, and that yields some profit, then that would count positively towards the U.S. balance of payments because it's a net flow of income into the U.S. There's also more direct transfers, so worker remittances are negative on the balance of payments. So that'd be if, say, migrant workers living in Germany sending money back to North Africa, that would count negatively for the German balance of payments. And finally, there's foreign aid, which is just fairly clear. It's going to count negatively on the balance of payments of just sending money out of the country. So that's the current account. So it's the net flows of incomes. Now, thinking more in terms of stocks, in the sense of stock versus flow, not financial stocks, we have the capital and financial account. The capital account includes capital transfer, so movement of productive machinery or productive capital between countries. Capital acquisitions and disposal of non-financial assets, so buying capital rather than moving the physical machine, but buying capital from a different country, say. And disposal of non-financial assets just means the disposal of productive machinery or things used in production rather than abstract financial capital, which is what is in the other half of this account, finance account. And so this is things like debt, equity, foreign direct investment, any other investment really, as well as the movement of reserve assets in and out of a country. And so what are the implications of these two concepts? Well, trade deficits or surpluses, which would be a current account issue, are only a small percentage of GDP, but for some nations it can be quite large as 50% of their economy. And one problem with having a large current account deficit, that means that you're purchasing more things from the rest of the world than you're selling to the rest of the world. And that means you're not going to have a lot of foreign currency around because you have to use your currency to buy other nations' currency to then buy whatever they produce, right? And so you're sending your money out to buy foreign currency because you're not selling them things which you're getting foreign currency for, right? So this can lead to a problem where you, as a nation, don't have enough foreign currency to purchase the imports that you would like to. This can be particularly problematic for economies that are not very large. If you're a very small economy and you're not capable of producing everything that your citizens want to consume, or, for instance, you've heavily specialized in something in which you have comparative advantage in producing, not having foreign currency to buy what you need can be a major problem. Likewise, a nation with a large capital account deficit has a net flow of money outside of the country, while a surplus means a net flow in. And if you've got a positive flow of capital coming into your country, then that means you're helping to kind of develop your productive capacities. And if there's a net flow out, then that means that, in a sense, that those resources are going to develop the productive capacities of other nations, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to be aware of. So zeroing in on one small aspect of this financial and capital, zeroing in on one specific aspect of the balance of payments, let's talk about foreign direct investment. So just in the purest definitional terms, foreign direct investment is whenever some foreign actor invests in a national economy. This can occur whenever a transnational firm sets up a new firm in a country, or if they purchase an existing firm, or if they buy a large stake in an existing firm, for instance, rather than purchasing the whole thing. And foreign direct investment can be really great. One need only look at China, for instance, like the limited trade liberalization of China and their export-oriented development strategy has been immensely successful and raised more people out of poverty in the last 25 years than any other project undertaken by humanity. And how does it do that? Well, it increases people's productivity. So we get better production technology, and it also helps support human capital development, right? So if you're bringing in better production technology, you also have to educate people on how to use that technology, right? This can also lead to a dissemination of technology throughout an economy. So a classic example here is, right, like for the longest time, most of the firms set up in the special economic zones in China were owned by foreign companies, where they made their specific investments in human capital and physical capital to produce the one thing that they wanted to produce. But in subsequent years, people that learned things there were able to set up different firms, and now there are many Chinese-owned firms that are competing with firms that were once just using the workers there to produce their own goods. Big example here would be like Huawei, right? Like they now are producing flagship phones after many people that are working there now gained experience working for foreign firms, right? So this is one way in which dissemination of technology and productive technique can move throughout a country. And similarly, foreign direct investment can help fund infrastructure. So if you want to draw a firm into your country, you need to have certain investments in electrical grid, roadways, and oftentimes firms will be willing to pay for that because they make so much savings in labor cost. Now, those are all kind of the positive effects of foreign direct investment, but there can also be some negative effects. If it exists as a pure enclave and does not integrate with the rest of the economy around it, it's not going to have as many of these positive spillover effects. It will only generate incomes, which is good, but it won't allow for this kind of human capital development and dissemination of technology. It's also problematic if these firms evade paying into local public goods. So sometimes firms are able to, rather than say, well, we need this road so that we can effectively produce things at this factory. They may instead evade paying into local construction of roads or shift more and more of the burden of that production onto an already less developed local economy. And so in that way, they're kind of gaining special favor from the the government of that nation by not pitching in to fund public good production. Foreign firms or firms that are purchased by foreign actors may crowd local firms out in product markets, which I think is fairly clear, right? Like if we see this even in, say, like a U.S. context where like the big box store moves into the small town and kills the small store, right? Like this is that, but on like an international scale. But it also may crowd them out of money markets, of capital markets, right? So why would I want to invest in the fruit seller if the chip fab down the road, it gives me a much higher rate of return? And so that's one way in which local firms may be crowded out and thus may kind of develop slower than they otherwise would have. And finally, and most kind of damning, is when firms seek to alter the laws of a country in a way that advantages them. So, for instance, we'll move a manufacturing plant to your country if you crack down on unions, for example, right? So there are examples of this in labor rights and environmental standards. And so we need to kind of keep that in mind, that this is a possible negative side effect of foreign direct investment. So foreign direct investment has become a larger and larger component of balance of payments over the years. Historically, foreign direct investment has flowed from developed nations to developing nations, but a lot of this is increasing in the developed world as there are kind of international mergers and acquisitions going on, right? So if a U.S. firm buys a large British firm, for example, that still is foreign direct investment in the British economy. And so the picture of that like line in the balance of payments being, oh, this is investment from developed economies into less developed economies, is less and less true as time goes on. Something to also think about is that foreign direct investment can be really volatile. Small changes in local economies and policy can lead investors to be frightened and pull investment from these developing economies. And this can create an unexpected capital account deficit. So as foreign direct investment becomes a larger and larger proportion of a developing economy's economy, that can expose them to more financial risk overall. Another aspect of this is that transnational corporations can evade taxation as they charge themselves prices that aren't really market prices. And because they're able to kind of dictate what these prices are, for instance, they could say, well, we had a consultant come in from the Chinese branch of this firm to the Irish branch of this firm, and that consulting fee that we charge ourselves is like $10 million, right? These are purely fictional accounting prices that allow them to post profits where the tax rate is lowest. Ireland was not an arbitrary choice in this theoretical example, right? That is one of the places where many firms post massive profits because their corporate tax rate is much lower than the rest of the world. Also, if nations do kind of more closely control their capital account, that can allow them to protect infant industries and allow them to develop with this kind of captive market at home before they have to compete globally. And so this is the classic example here is the Japanese auto manufacturers who are able to kind of build up their productive capability with this like highly tariffed, quoted Japanese auto market that they didn't have to compete with the American manufacturers. and that's how they got so competent. So, just to kind of echo back to something I talked about in the last class, is immigration, right? So what we've been talking about up to this point is globalization of capital and of commodities, but what about labor? So, as previously alluded to, labor cannot be easily imported without also importing the workers, the people that come with it, right? And immigration has both up and downs, and there are no simple answers. So on the pro side, on average, immigrants tend to contribute more in taxes than they consume in services. Cultural diversity has certain social and technological advantages. And most often, immigrants come to fill jobs that natives don't even want anyway, so those jobs would otherwise remain vacant. On the con side, low-skilled native workers, these are the same workers that have been hit hardest by globalization of commodities, suffer a fall in wages. Simply because their sort of labor becomes relatively more abundant and the price falls, right? Another concern here is brain drain. So there is a theory that high incomes in the developed world can pull away the most talented people from the developing world, leading to this brain drain where, say, doctors, for instance, end up in the U.S. because incomes for doctors are much higher here. There is a counter-argument to this called the brain gain argument, that the promise of high incomes in the developed world leads to more people pursuing becoming doctors in the first place. That second point is perhaps somewhat less valid, because in both the US and in most nations in the world, the supply of doctors is not demand constrained, it's supply constrained. There's a limited number of seats in medical schools, right? And so that's the stopping point. That's the bottleneck. The bottleneck isn't people wanting to become doctors. The bottleneck is our ability to produce doctors, right, on a global scale. And so, especially for extremely high skill jobs that require many years of education, it's likely that the people that pursue those jobs, their supply of labor is not constrained by people wanting to pursue that employment. And if only it had higher income, then more and more people would do it. It's probably the case that it's supply constrained at the educational level. And so it's likely that the brain drain argument is much more valid than the brain gain argument. Another aspect of this whole bounds of payments thing is remittances. And remittances have immense implications for local economies in the developing world. A remittance is just a payment by someone who's working in a foreign nation back to someone in their home nation. And on the upside, they support consumption and investment, right? So if incomes are much higher in the US and you can send money back home, then somebody back home may be able to start a business or get an education, or simply just support their own consumption, right? But there are some implications of this for the receiving country. This flow of foreign funds into a country, if it's on a large enough scale, can increase the currency value in that country. So if a lot of dollars flow into Mexico, that can increase the value of the peso. And you might think, well, okay, high value currency is good, right? That means that you can buy lots of things from the rest of the world because your currency is strong. Yes, but it also has implications for trade. So if the peso is very, very strong, then that makes Mexican exports relatively more expensive to the rest of the world. And so it can a large scale of remittances can actually kind of undercut an export-oriented development strategy. And so that's something to keep in mind. So back to the issue of immigration. Between 1990 and 2010, immigrants as a proportion of population in the rich countries, grew from 7.8 to 11.4%. But on a global scale, the total percentage of immigrants hasn't really changed over that period, which means that most immigration that occurs is not between middle income or low income countries. It's from middle to lower income countries to higher income countries, which is consistent with our discussion of the citizenship income premium last week. So, despite the total percentage of immigrants being about the same between 1990 and 2010, remittances have become much larger. In most countries, it's only a few percentage of GDP, but for some small nations, it can be as much as 30%. So it can be very, very large proportions of an economy's GDP. So that's just kind of the whole outline of what's going on in terms of immigration and remittances. Let's pivot here to our final discussion on trade agreements. So this is in reference to the Roderick reading. So economists generally favor free trade and free trade agreements, and this is, in a sense, in our intellectual heritage all the way back to David Ricardo talking about wool and wine. And even in this argument of comparative advantage and specialization make us all better off, kind of held water for a very long time, and it held water because trade barriers were actually quite high. So free-to-trade agreements were once these simple documents that sought to just lift quotas and reduce tariffs, right? Just generally reduce the barriers of trade. But this is very different from what contemporary trade agreements do. Contemporary trade agreements do a lot more and are far more specific. They cover things from regulatory standards, health and safety rules, investment rules, banking and finance regulation, intellectual property enforcement, labor standards, and environmental standards, and a whole host of other aspects of domestic policy. And so they reach far beyond national borders. So essentially, these trade agreements tie the hands of domestic governments when it comes to issues of, say, domestic policy. But these trade agreements are also politically contested documents that allow well-connected firms to negotiate preferential treatment by domestic governments. So, essentially, one way to characterize this is that powerful firms are able to get special privileges in some nations by negotiating these trade agreements, and it's all kind of under the guise of it being trade liberalization. But in no sense is giving one firm special treatment trade liberalization. It's in fact quite the opposite. The most kind of present example of this is the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is this far-reaching agreement with a number of nations kind of circling the Pacific that became a big hot-button issue last year. So when it comes to intellectual property, there's always been a big balancing act between protecting intellectual property rights on one hand while not stifling developing nations on the other. And so there have been a large number of exceptions to intellectual property rights for a very long time. Some examples are inventions whose commercial exploitation needs to be prevented to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. Diagnostic, therapeutic, and surgical methods for treating humans or animals, and certain animal and plant inventions were all given kind of exceptions to intellectual property rights rules. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have increased trade, increased intellectual property rights enforcement, And rather than giving us all of these kind of exceptions that allow developing nations to exploit these technologies more easily. The TPP also had in it rules about cross-border capital flows, essentially further financial account liberalization, less and less control of nations over the capital that flows in and out. Investor-state dispute settlement procedures. This is actually quite fascinating. So essentially, the idea was that, say, for instance, an American firm is engaging in some trade or is engaging in some investment in Japan, for instance. And a policy is put in place that makes that investment less profitable for the American firm by the Japanese government. Under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the American investor would be able to essentially take the Japanese government to a specialized trade court and essentially sue them for lost profits. Importantly, Japanese firms in this instance would not be given the same right because they have no recourse to sue their own government over foregone profits. So, in essence, this investor-state dispute settlement process privileged foreign firms over domestic firms, regardless of what nation we're talking about. And also, there was a provisions about the harmonization of regulatory standards, which seems kind of like benign on the surface of it, but it's important to remember that different nations have different kind of cultural and social attitudes about commodity production. So while one nation may find one commodity's production perfectly acceptable, another may not for various cultural or social reasons. And so harmonization of regulatory standards in many ways ties domestic governments to the will of international bodies and limits the scope for domestic policy. It's arguable to say whether that's good or bad. A lot of that depends on what the conclusions of the international body are, which is very, very difficult to have any faith in, especially an example of more recent trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that are fully negotiated in secret. It's impossible to really know what firms had what influence in it because it's entirely behind closed doors. No individual citizen of any party nation could go and read the current draft of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In fact, in the U.S. case, access to the actual documents was highly, highly regulated to high-ranking senators on relevant committees, and they had to read it in a secured document area. So to give you an idea of how seriously they take the secrecy of these negotiations. So, as in the examples above, relating specifically to the TPP, many provisions of modern trade agreements have very little to do with free trade at all. They are more often ways that powerful actors get policy changed in ways that favor them. So, up top there's kind of Ricardo talking about, why free trade. It's important to note that especially when economies are very different sizes, large nations can exploit their market power to achieve better outcomes. And so this creates an incentive for other nations to put up trade barriers. And so this would make everyone, including the large nations, worse off. And so in a more optimistic view, trade agreements are one way to commit future governments, particularly the governments of large economies, to commit to free trade into the future in some sort of credible way. And so in essence, we're kind of giving up domestic democratic control over trade openness for credible commitment of trade openness in the future. We'll get into more specifics on the history of it next week, but early negotiations to create more free trade, like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade after the Second World War, was basically just about quotas and tariffs. While more recent negotiations are like things like the TPP that we previously talked about, regulatory harmonization, intellectual property rights, gaining additional protections for trade and services that in essence benefits developed economies that's economies are much more made up of service sectors over developing economies that may want more liberalization in terms of commodity trade. It's also important to note that large, powerful firms get a seat at the table at these negotiations, but large, powerful unions do not. And so that, in essence, puts national level labor policy on the chopping block for these trade agreements. So freer trade is opposed when it goes against these special interests. So, for instance, a policy idea that kind of floats around from time to time is international tax and subsidy discipline, where nations should limit the amount of subsidization of domestic industries so that everybody's kind of competing on level playing field. And this is kind of well accepted in, for instance, the World Trade Organization. So, if a nation does engage in illegal subsidies, they can be brought up into the dispute resolution process of the World Trade Organization and fined. In a very recent example of this, it was a case between Brazil and the U.S., where Brazil brought the U.S. up saying, you're unfairly subsidizing your cotton industry, and that's making Brazilian cotton exports not competitive on the international market. And the U.S. lost that case. The World Trade Organization ruled in Brazil's favor and, said the U.S. government must pay Brazilian cotton producers X number of dollars. I believe it was a quite large settlement, too. And what does the U.S. do? The U.S. just keeps paying the fine because it's a large enough economy that it can afford to just keep paying that fine. And large cotton producers are politically well connected. And so this subsidy discipline doesn't really take place when it comes to large, powerful actors in these international institutions. Another example of this is international tax discipline. It would be very nice globally if all nations had the same corporate tax rate, for instance. Then we wouldn't have the issue of tax havens like Ireland, right? But every nation has an incentive to essentially undercut the other nation, right? So if, down to near zero, right? Because if you can cut your corporate tax rate to just below, say, Ireland, then all of those profits flow into your nation, and even though you've lowered your corporate tax rate, you get increased revenue in the form of corporate taxes overall. And this essentially pits many national governments against one another. And so international tax rate discipline doesn't ever really take place either. So one argument that Roderick brings up at the end of his piece is that many kind of critics of this kind of position that maybe free trade agreements don't really have that much to do with free trade anymore is just giving ammunition to the barbarians, and they'll say, well, we need to just become self-sufficient and go back to that, which is clearly not what Roderick is trying to argue here. So this is just I'll leave this up for a moment, but I think this very much sums up the nuance of Roderick's argument that we should be cautious about free trade agreements because oftentimes they've got very little to actually do with free trade, and they're not really making us all that much better off. Not to mention all of those distributional consequences we talked about at the very beginning of this lecture. So, I think I already covered that, so let's kind of skip that. So, just to wrap up, freer trade expands a nation's consumption possibilities, but it has these distributional consequences, and we should think about those, especially when absolute levels of barrier to trade are quite low. Well-managed trade can be a really great tool for economic development, but unmanaged trade can hurt a nation. Balance of payments is just one way that we look at the flows of trade and capital. Immigration can be a tool for human development and development back home in the form of remittances supporting investment, but it can create some issues in terms of balance of payments and currency values. And finally, contemporary free trade agreements are less about free trade and more about this special treatment and lobbying. So that's all I've got for this lecture. We'll dig right into the next part of globalization. There'll be a little more of a political economy take in the next lecture. Thanks.